Hello everyone. The title of this paper is NCMax, Breaking the Security-Performance Tradeoff of Nakamoto Consensus. It originates from a very simple idea, which took me 3 years to develop. You can evaluate for yourself whether the message, which appears at the very end of this presentation, is worthy of my efforts. Here's the outline. I'll start with a brief introduction to Nakamoto Consensus and its limitations, and then introduce our design and evaluate it. Nakamoto Consensus and its successors. The cypherpunk movement, starting from the 1990s, leads to the inception of Bitcoin. As Bitcoin's consensus protocol, Nakamoto Consensus, NC for short, is the first public permissionless consensus protocol. A consensus protocol maintains a ledger that everyone agrees, append-only and ever-growing. In NC, the ledger is organized as a chain of blocks. Each contains a set of transactions. To guarantee its availability, each network participant keeps a copy of the ledger. How do we write on the ledger? The ledger extension process is called mining. In this process, miners, a special kind of participants, compete in solving a cryptographic puzzle generated from the latest block and a group of new transactions. Whoever finds the solution broadcasts a new block. What happens if 2 blocks broadcast simultaneously? We call this situation a fork. The core of NC is a backbone protocol, which guides us in resolving the forks. It prescribes that during a fork, miners choose the chain that is most computationally challenging to produce, which is usually the longest chain, or in a tie, the first received block. Another component in the backbone protocol is a difficulty adjustment mechanism, which periodically adjusts the target, as in the right equation, to stabilize the block interval. A decade after its invention, NC is still the most popular permissionless consensus protocol. Personally, I like NC for 3 reasons. First, it has a minimum set of security assumptions. As security researchers, we all know that the number of security assumptions directly translates to the number of vulnerabilities. Therefore, thanks to NC's few security assumptions, the security of its backbone protocol is carefully scrutinized and well understood in all these papers. Second, it minimizes the communication overhead incurred by the consensus protocol itself. For example, in Bitcoin, each block takes only 1 message to propagate, and propagating a 1 megabyte block equals propagating a compact block of roughly 13 kilobytes. Compact block is Bitcoin's bandwidth optimization technique. Observing that most transactions in a block are already synchronized when the block is mined, there is no need to transmit these transactions again. Therefore, with compact block enabled, node replaces the transactions in blocks, typically 200 to 500 bytes each, with their short IDs, which is only 6 bytes each. We note that the compact block mechanism not only reduces the bandwidth consumption, but also decreases the block propagation latency in the best case. When all transactions in the block are already synchronized, a node can reconstruct the block in its memory and forward the compact block to its downstream peers within 100 milliseconds after receiving the CB. The third reason why I like NC is that it has a natural transaction order, thanks to the chain-based ledger structure. Both transaction validity and transaction execution results are straightforward. To sum up, we start from NC's backbone for its security, simplicity, and flexibility. Later protocols have their merits, but none of them comprehensively outperforms NC. NC's backbone is still a best base for further innovation. Old school is the best school. Second, NC's limitations. What limitations? The icon basically spoils it. NC suffers from a security performance trade-off. As the block interval follows exponential distribution, most of the bandwidth is idle. To reduce idle time, we can either raise the block size or decrease the block interval. Both approaches lead to more orphaned blocks. Blocks do not end up in the main chain. In the right figure, time goes from left to right. A diamond-shaped dot indicates when a block is mined. A curve indicates the block propagation latency. On the one hand, if we raise the block size, the block propagation latency becomes longer, leads to more orphaned blocks. On the other hand, if we decrease the block interval, there will be more frequent block mining events, which also leads to more orphaned blocks. This phenomenon is also reflected in our simulation. As you can see in this figure, when we reduce the block interval, meaning that when we move from the right side to the left side, the number of orphaned blocks increases. Also, when we raise the transaction processing workload, orphan blocks also increases. Is that a bad thing? That is a bad thing. As you can see in this figure, when there are many orphan blocks, the attacker no longer needs more than half of the blocks to secretly generate a longer chain. Also, the bandwidth used to propagate these orphan blocks are wasted, as they do not contribute to transaction confirmation. Alternative consensus protocols either modify or abandon the backbone protocol. Both approaches negatively affect NC's security, simplicity, and flexibility. Therefore, in this paper, we would like to answer the following question. Can we break this trade-off while keeping the backbone protocol intact? Here comes NCMax. To break this trade-off, we first need to identify the crux of it. In other words, how can we reduce the number of orphans? Naturally, we want to reduce the block propagation delay. Then, how can we reduce it? We want to reduce the number of fresh transactions in the block. What are they? Fresh transactions are newly broadcast transactions that have not finished propagating to the network when they are embedded in blocks. How do they slow down the block propagation? In NC's block propagation mechanism, as we mentioned before, when there is no fresh transactions, upon receiving a complex block, a node forwards it to its downstream peers directly. However, when there are fresh transactions, the node needs to first query these fresh transactions, and then reconstruct the block and forward the compact block to its downstream peers. This extra round trip increased the one-hop block propagation latency from 100 milliseconds to 0.5 to 2 seconds. We confirm this bottleneck via several experiments, which either collects data from or simulates the Bitcoin network. We are now ready for the main contribution of this paper. To remove fresh transactions in NCMax, we decouple the transaction confirmation process into two steps. A transaction must first be proposed in the transaction proposal zone with its truncated IDs, and then committed with its full content after wclose to wfar blocks, a window of W blocks. You can consider the transaction commitment zone as the transaction zone in NC's block format, and the transaction proposal zone, which is the blue part, as a new field, whose main purpose is to synchronize fresh transactions. It is important to note that the validity of the transactions in the proposal zone does not affect the block's validity. The proposed transactions can be malformed, illegal, or even missing, but that doesn't matter. Later miners can just skip them. In our block propagation protocol, upon receiving the compact block, a node can reconstruct all transactions in its commitment zone as these transactions are already synchronized after receiving the predecessor blocks. The node then forwards the compact block to its downstream peers and query the fresh transactions in the proposal zone simultaneously. This two-step mechanism removes the fresh transaction synchronization process from the critical path of the block propagation. Thus, blocks can always be propagated at the highest possible speed permitted by the network. As shown in this figure, the two-step transaction confirmation mechanism allows us to fully utilize the node's bandwidth to synchronize transactions without raising the number of orphans. Transaction synchronization cannot overlap with later blocks propagation. By decoupling transaction synchronization and confirmation, we can process the transactions in parallel, similar to block DAG protocols, while preserving the chain-based structure. By recoupling the two-step in an updated block structure, we inherit NC's security properties and simplicity in reward distribution. To evaluate its security, recall that NC's backbone protocol includes its fork resolving rules, namely longest chain and first received, and its difficulty adjustment. As NCMax faithfully inherits NC's backbone protocol, there is not much to say in terms of security. It differs from NC only in the liveness property of the transaction ledger, which you can find in the paper. We evaluate the performance of NCMax in a simulation environment that emulates the Bitcoin network. We choose a low bandwidth deliberately so that the network is always the bottleneck of the protocol. In NC's block propagation, there is no fresh transaction only when the block interval is long, namely at least 20 seconds. When there are fresh transactions, the medium latency grows from 3 to 20 seconds along with the block size. In contrast, in NCMax, there is no fresh transaction regardless of the transaction processing workload. The latency is constant, roughly 600 milliseconds, in line with Bitcoin's current situation. NCMax orphan rate is independent of the transaction processing workload. In this figure, the three curves of NCMax overlap with each other. We compare the throughput of NCMax with Prism, a state-of-the-art block DAG protocol. NCMax performs the best. We discovered that Prism's throughput heavily relies on a system parameter called the number of colors. It performs better when there are more colors. However, more colors in Prism comes at the price of higher transaction confirmation latency. In this metric, NCMax and Prism are comparable. NCMax is 3 to 6.6 times faster than Nakamoto Consensus. To conclude, we chose NC as a base for further innovation. To break the security performance trade-off, namely to reduce the number of orphans, we propose the two-step transaction confirmation mechanism, which preserves NC's merits. Here are some frequently asked questions regarding this idea and their short answers. Please read the paper for their complete answers. Our contributions are applicable to other scenarios. With this paper, we would like to remind the blockchain community that there are actually two parallel processing approaches in distributed systems: pipelining and concurrency. Previous designs mostly focus on the concurrency approach. This design brings forward the pipelining approach, which enjoys several merits. And last, we would like to bring forward the importance of the network layer, which is long overlooked by protocol designers. This picture is the starting point of the entire design and the past several years of my work. We argue that, before abandoning a well-scrutinized protocol, one should take a look at the actual bottleneck, experimentally confirm it, and try to eliminate it. We believe such an incremental approach, although not necessarily in line with the blockchain industry's eagerness for revolutionary breakthroughs, is meaningful and inspirational because it allows an easy transfer of our knowledge. I'm looking forward to your questions.